This is Pantheon Plus, a podcast where we go beyond tights and flights to explore other genres and movies from the past. Each month we have a theme. This month we're on the road again, as Willie Nelson would say. For Road Trip Month, it's the third week in our journey. Each week we pick a road trip movie, and this week we look at 1995's Tommy Boy, an underrated classic.
Education laid the foundation.
I got a D plus!
Heredity opened the door. And dedication took it from there.
Do we really want to put the future of the company in Tommy's hands?
Paramount Pictures presents
It's a clip, huh? Are you sure?
Chris Farley,
That's gonna leave a mark.
David Spade,
Yikes.
Tommy Boy.
Did you live under power lines as a kid or something?
Rated PG-13.
My name is Brian DeBrain. You can find me on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review as to help people discover the show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so by following us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. And my co-host, of course, for this week and every week this month will be Jerome Cuson. He can be found on Twitter at JeromeC1985. And last week we were in 1988. We were still having that 80s vibe. We're moving on 7 years later. It's the mid-90s. And people call this the Renaissance for SNL because it had that downturn in the 80s. And I'm not a big SNL fan, but I grew up watching tons of reruns on Comedy Central from this era of SNL. So I love Chris Farley, David Spade, Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, everybody from this era. And this was kind of like, you know, the height of it all in terms of your fandom for SNL and all those comedians back then, because, you know, Chris Farley's big starring role, this was his first one, along with David Spade, and they've been just, you know, up until this point, they were bit side players here and there. They were working their ass off on SNL, and somehow, in some way, they convinced Lorne Michaels to produce a movie with them as the starring roles, and somehow, some way, it became this cult classic, and I know a lot of people shit on it when it came out, but to me, it's got this heart to it, and I think you would agree on that.
Yeah, I don't think this is necessarily a great movie. I don't think this is a bad movie either. I think that very often we like to deal in absolutes in these binaries of, oh, this is the greatest movie ever, this movie's the worst piece of shit. I think this movie is generally very funny. I think there are aspects of it that have not aged well, but I think that Chris Farley unto himself is just this force of nature that, you know, it's a shame that we did not get to see him evolve and grow into a better actor, perhaps, and maybe do dramas and all the things that you see from so many other comedians. But I think what you see here is you see Chris Farley at the peak of his powers. I think you see David Spade at the peak of his powers, because I think with so many of these actors and these performers from SNL, I think what you see is they go into SNL, they become these huge stars, and I think in this case that entire class just became enormous stars. And to an extent, Adam Sandler is still very much an important part of filmmaking, and whether that's the broad comedies that he does on Netflix that I would never watch, and other more serious dramas that he's done over the years, and in whatever attempt to gain credibility. But I think what kind of happens with some of these performers is that, you know, they'll hit SNL and then they'll have a decade and a half of just being in really funny movies and being kind of at the peak of their powers and being really important. And then I think they kind of become parodies of themselves. And I think you even see that, you see both sides of that in this movie, I think. You see Chris Farley at the peak of his powers, and you see Dan Aykroyd slowly morphing into a parody of himself.
Yeah, that's kind of the story with these SNL arcs, I want to call them, and they all have these different stories and stuff. Probably Eddie Murphy is probably the most successful, I would say. But I mean, that's, you know, a topic for another day. But because I don't even watch SNL now. To me, it was just Comedy Central as a kid reruns, and Chris Farley was the man, and Adam Sandler was like my number two. And but just the physicality and the role that he puts into this, it's just unbelievable, and he does it for every role. But he really, I mean, he's the I don't want to call him the Mick Foley necessarily, but it does feel like he was comedy's Mick Foley, and he was just bumping his ass off in this movie. But I feel like this movie, like I mentioned, has this heart to it, and I think the reason it does is because it's written by Bonnie and Terry Turner. Now, these two also wrote Wayne's World 1 and 2, which I saw those as a kid in theaters as well, and I actually like Wayne's World 2 more than one, and Coneheads, and I like that movie a lot too. Which I think all three of those movies, despite how stupid they can be and all the frat humor that it has, I feel those movies out of those early SNL bunch of movies, those were just the best because they had this heart to them, and you were like you love the characters by the end of the movie, and you're rooting for them, and you're definitely rooting for Tommy Boy here, and Conehead, you're rooting for the family to get back home, and of course, you're rooting for Wayne and Garth. So I think there's something in their formula, and I think that their formula carried very well over here. And I don't know how you feel about those movies, but I love those movies growing up, watching them and recording them on actual VHS as a kid, and like cutting out the commercials and stuff on the VHS. I love those movies, man. I don't know how you feel about them.
When I think about Saturday Night Live and kind of the movies of Saturday Night Live, I think what is most interesting about those movies is the fact that they were made for relatively cheap. They were made for relatively inexpensive prices, and what you ended up with is you ended up with some very profitable movies, because even if the movies did not necessarily do really well in theaters, the home video market was so robust at that point that I think that's where a lot of these movies made their money. And I think that's true for Wayne's World, Wayne's World 2, this movie, Night at the Roxbury. There's so many that I could list, even the Adam Sandler movies like Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore, because there's a rewatchability factor with these comedies. And playing on cable television as well, being on the Paramount Network or Comedy Central, that also plays a huge role in that as well, because these movies are 90 minutes long. It's not much of a commitment, and generally you can come into these movies at any point and kind of get into them and enjoy them, regardless of the scene that you're watching. So I think that for years, this was a very successful formula for Saturday Night Live. It is not the case anymore, just because movie making has changed so much. SNL has changed so much, and I think that what you are seeing is you are seeing more of a matriculation to streaming television and maybe even sitcoms and other kinds of shows, as opposed to trying to do their own star vehicles. And I think it's been kind of a struggle for recent SNL performers to become as famous as some of their counterparts. And I think another part of that is that there's so many more sketch comedy shows. So I don't know if the SNL people are able to stick out as much relative to an Amy Schumer who had her own show on Comedy Central. And in the past it was SNL and that was it. But now there's just so many other shows that are similar, and in some cases I think even better, because they're not live and they're not forced to go every week, and Colin Jost is not the head writer. That also helps. But I think that it's really interesting to see kind of the history of this show, and the fact that it has never produced an Academy Award winning actor, which I think is fascinating. And I think that from a comedic standpoint, it's really hard for these guys to transition into more serious roles. And I think it's unfortunate, but it's kind of the reality. And SNL is obviously a major franchise for NBC, but they rely so much on celebrities now that I don't even know, like, how easy is it to break out on Saturday Night Live at this point?
Yeah, I think there's also a generational thing to that. I mean, you can also apply like the NBA draft classes of certain years were just spectacular in comparison to other years. So in theory, you can just say like the early '90s was like the 2003 draft class or the '95 draft class of the NBA kind of thing, which produced so many legends. But it just could be one of those situational things, or like you said, it's just different platforms. But I think right now the guy to keep your eye on is Pete Davidson. I'm not a big fan of his, but I mean, he's going to be in Suicide Squad, and that's partly comedy, part action, so we can see kind of how he is there. But I heard he's fantastic in that movie. Was it King of Staten Island or something like that? But we'll see. I mean, it's just everyone has a different journey, but hopefully no one goes down the dark journey that Chris Farley unfortunately went through because unfortunately his career cut short due to his demons. But it is what it is. But it's an interesting note too. Lorne Michaels, he took that break in the '80s and then came back to SNL and produced a bunch of movies as well. But every movie that he's produced that has his name in the producer credit, every movie has a poster with clouds and a blue sky in the background. And I couldn't believe it at first, and I looked into this, and it's absolutely true. You look at the poster for this movie, Black Sheep, Coneheads, Wayne's World 1 and 2, even I think The Ladies' Man is another one I looked at. They all have it, and it's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it myself. It's just one of those things that kind of slips by you, and then for me as a graphic designer, it just kind of opened my eyes and maybe even think even more and look into more of how to design the subconscious, because it kind of, subconsciously you see that and you think, yeah, those are like the SNL movies from the 90s when I see those posters. And you mentioned the VHSs and the VHS covers, and that probably had a little bit to do with that too, because graphic design and, subconscious advertising go hand in hand. So it was really interesting to note here that Rob Lowe doesn't get a credit, and you look on his IMDb credit, he's not credited to this movie at all. And I was shocked, and then you look why. It's just one of those legal things. I guess legally you can't be tied to two movies at the same time contractually or whatever. He was, he was also filming The Stand, the TV miniseries at the time, which is also pretty good if you want to check that out. It's just really long, but total contrast in the roles because he's a total nice guy in that one. This one, he's a complete asshole. But props to Rob Lowe, because I don't know if he did it for free. I doubt it. Maybe they just paid him under the table. But he's a friend of Farley's, man. So it was really interesting that he did it as a friend or as a favor to a friend, and it really paid off. Even though he kind of was inept as a villain, but we'll talk about that a little later. The part where they go fat guy in the little coat, the legendary bit where he puts on Spade's coat and he's singing the song and everything. That classic moment that's everyone's probably top 3 moments in the movie. That actually came from real life. When they're in the writers' room back in the day in SNL, when they were trying to break the monotony and break the tension when they couldn't come up with anything, he would just kind of make them laugh by doing that skit and that bit. And he did it a couple times, and they wanted to add it to the movie because they figured, well, we need we need to add a little scene here. If people think it's, if we think it's funny, then hopefully other people think it's funny as well. And it got over. So I thought that was a little cute little thing you can pull from real life if you need to fill in some scenes in a comedy. Just kind of, as long as it, contributes to the plot. I think if you pull some stuff from real life, you can always find funny stuff from real life. So that was interesting. Of course, we mentioned, being this an SNL, produced movie, quote unquote. They were flying back and forth from Toronto, where they film it, to New York, back and forth all the time. So it's one of those crazy, hectic schedules you hear about when TV actors are trying to transcend. You heard about this with Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future. Those infamous stories of him like being up 24 hours a day filming both his show and Back to the Future at the same time. I can only imagine what these guys were going through, especially with the demons that Farley was going through at the time. I can only imagine, but part of that pain comes through in the art. We've kind of seen that through that Robin Williams documentary on HBO. I think it was HBO, but I think a part of it you can kind of see whenever he puts himself physically in a role, especially Chris Farley. Like, he puts it all on the line, and you see it here, man. And he put it out, full force, especially when he takes that table bump. But another fun note before we go into what still works about this movie. I think this went over my head the first time. I knew that Bo Derek was obviously the star of 10 back in '79. And then, of course, whoa, Dad, she's like a 10. But, of course, I didn't even realize until I put the notes together. Brian Dennehy, who plays, of course, Big Tom, Tom's dad, was also in 10, which goes to show you, we mentioned last week how we talk about these character actors who just are in everything. I guess he was in everything because this was a reuniting between the two, and I didn't even realize it until... I've seen this movie 10 times. I didn't even know that. So what does that go? There's all these little things you find out about movies, and I think Brian Dennehy is one of those cinematic treasures where you can do the 6 degrees of separation and find all these crazy movies that he was in with other people. I recently found out he was in a movie with Tom Hanks and John Candy, which I think is on HBO Max now, which I have to probably seek out. So it's just one of those things. But Brian Dennehy, I think, is one of those tremendous actors that not necessarily doesn't get the credit, but he was cool being a character actor. If you've ever seen, I don't know if this is just my high school, but we when we read Death of a Salesman, the play, we watched his performance, and I don't know if you've seen it, Jerome, but it's powerful, like really powerful stuff, and it was recorded on one of his off nights, I heard. So, have you seen that performance?
I have not. The only version I've seen is the one with Dustin Hoffman in the titular role.
Wow, I would highly recommend that because whenever I think of Brian Denny, I think of the two things: him being Tommy Boy's dad and that amazing performance he did on stage of Death of the Salesman. So check that out. So let's kind of go at what works in this movie. I think, of course, the great chemistry between Farley and Spade. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but people think I don't know if you agree, but David Spade was at his funniest when he was with Chris Farley. I think it's true. I still think I love Joe Dirt from 2001 a little bit more than most, which is fine. It's just my sensibilities. But that's a David Spade solo joint. But in this case, yeah, I think it's true because they just play off each other so well, and you can tell the relationship grows throughout the movie. At first they hate each other, and you kind of sense the tension. But then by the end of the movie, it gets really heartfelt. And I think that's what really helps this movie a lot is that relationship, as they're going on the road. And the fact that they go through all that shit. And the stuff with the deer was great. And the fact that the car keeps getting messed up, which I think at this point, I didn't realize it, when I watched it the first 10 times, but I think that's an homage to Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, you think?
I think that's certainly a possibility, but I think that what makes this movie work is the chemistry between the two lead performers. And I think David Spade is almost better in this role because he gets to play kind of the straight man playing off the shenanigans of Chris Farley. And I think that between this and to an extent, I think Black Sheep, which isn't nearly as successful as this one, I think that's why these movies work, is because because the problem with David Spade in a lead role is he's very smarmy and very sarcastic, and that's something that came across in a lot of his SNL skits as well, is that he was very sarcastic. That doesn't necessarily play as well when you're trying to be a lead, and I think the fact that he gets to be kind of a smartass and playing off the more genteel Chris Farley, I think is what makes this movie work so well. And I think that the fact that it's amazing to think that these two really only did 2 movies together. If they had had the opportunity to do more, I mean, who knows what their legacies would have been. It probably would have changed David Spade's for sure if they were able to successfully make more movies together. And I think David Spade would probably be more well thought of. But at this point, it's Tommy Boy, I think, is generally the one that is most well regarded. And Black Sheep is is much more of a mixed bag. But yeah, undoubtedly the major reason that this movie works is because of their chemistry. Because so much of the movie relies on them, especially that middle portion when they're on the road, relies on them and just bouncing off of each other in the car.
Yeah, totally. And I'm not as big of a fan of Black Sheep either. I just feel like it didn't have the heart that this movie has, and you got to credit the writing on that one. I think the writing is what really ties this movie together. It could have been completely off the rails and just stupid frat comedy, which it looks like they just try to throw in there and kind of throw in themselves. But I think at the heart of it all, the script is what kind of holds things together in this movie a lot. And then, of course, you got Farley taking these insane bumps, like I mentioned. At the beginning of the movie, he takes a bong rip and takes a face plant through a table. It's clearly Chris Farley. You can't, there's no body double for Chris Farley, I don't think, ever. There probably was in the 90s, but no way. He's doing his own stunts. And he did this, I couldn't believe it. Every time I see it, it's amazing. When he's checking his grade at the beginning of the movie, and then the camera pulls back and does a one take, and he does a cartwheel in the hallway. And I'm just like, what the fuck? Because even the most athletic wrestlers I've seen can't do a cartwheel that clean. And somehow Farley, coked up as he was probably with all that energy and going, he just fucking did it, man. And that's just the beauty of Chris Farley and also the tragedy, I think, of Chris Farley, because he's just so willing to put his body on the line. And sometimes it's not even necessary. Like, he did not need, as funny as the table bump was, it's just, you just don't need it. And I know I'm sounding like an old school wrestling guy right now, but when it comes to physical comedy, to me, it's got to be worth it and not too over the top. But I just felt like Farley just always just going for it, man. And you saw that, and even in Black Sheep, when he's doing that thing, when he's rolling down the hill, it felt like a lot. And it felt like maybe too much, and that maybe that contributed, probably did, just like the pain of it all, maintaining it all. And I've heard these stories too about Chevy Chase, where Chevy Chase was really, going hard in Fletch and doing all these physical comedy stuff in the 70s, and by the 80s and 90s, he's just a different person because he probably had some concussions and didn't even realize it because of all this physical comedy. So it's really interesting, especially when I was, listening and finding some stories about Mick Foley, the wrestler, and just kind of comparing that to like, a Farley. It's really interesting that, where comedians take this physical comedy. It dates back to like Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, but they were smart about it. But I'm always kind of worried. But nowadays, it's not as big of a deal. There's hardly anyone doing physical comedy. But some of these comedians back in the day really took it too far, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this might be a byproduct of the time period and the fact that I think our sensibilities about comedy have changed a lot over the course of the last 20 years or so. And I think comedy is constantly reinventing itself. And what was funny at one point is not as funny. And I think what Chris Farley, David Spade, Rob Schneider, Adam Sandler, I mean, they were very much of the gross out, to an extent, punching down kind of comedy because, I mean, I think you hear it and you see it in so many of these movies. They have a very specific point of view, the way they feel about certain people and class groups. And I mean, just think about how often the word retard is used in this movie, and that's just not something that you would hear. And I think that this is a representation. Chris Farley, and the fact that he is doing so much physicality, I think is a byproduct of that time period. And would you see it now? Maybe, but I think Chris Farley is very much somebody who always wanted to be these legendary performers, and the physicality was a huge part of that. And I mean, I think he's the person that would talk about wanting to be John Belushi, and in an unfortunate way, he turned out to be that person and behave in just that way. And it really sucks because I think he is somebody who was very talented and was able to be funny at this time. Again, I don't know if his brand of comedy would necessarily be funny now, but I think for that time period it worked. And I mean, it's unfortunate because we're talking about a person who was on SNL for a number of years, and then he did a couple of movies, and then he's passed away. And it's such a weird thing to think about because I think you see this with a lot of entertainers who die when they're too young, is that they have such a limited amount of work. And I think that limited amount of work becomes amplified because there really isn't anything else. And you always wonder what might have been.
And that's why this has become his iconic role, because of the cult status and his few movie titles that he had. So it's unfortunate, but at the same time, like you said, it's part of the time frame. And I mean, I'm still laughing at it now, but you can't help but cringe a little bit when you see Mick Foley get thrown off the Hell in a Cell. You know what I mean? So, and then credit to David Newman, who made the score. I felt like this was a big, thing for the movie that it needed. If they would have just did like, we'll put a compilation of rock songs together, throw it in there, and kind of like Airheads or some other Adam Sandler movies. But this score really helped a lot. Like, it really brought the heart out of the movie. Especially at the end when they played the theme and then, the music hits with the sailboat. I thought that was really well timed because it made it heartfelt and serious. You know what I mean? It wasn't, I think any other kind of score, if you did like that compilation type score, I don't know. I think a soundtrack would not have worked well at all. Even though it did have a cool like soundtrack in the middle when they're doing road trip songs, which is great because that's one of those things that everyone does on a road trip, which is totally one of those things that still works today. But I think the score really helped. It was like a contrast because the score sounds like a family PG movie, right? But it's a PG-13, over the top comedy from the 90s. So I thought it was a great contrast that worked. And it just made, everything more emotional, I thought, and for certain scenes especially. So, and then the wedding scene I thought very well done as well. The right type of score. So, and the other cool thing I think is the background, especially you see at the beginning when Tommy Boy comes back to his town. And all these places are dying around him. All these factories, mom and pop places, they're just dying around him. And I like the theme in the background where the whole idea of maintaining this factory is to save the town and keep the town running. And it's just, it's very much that Michael Moore, Detroit and, Roger and Me, that kind of feeling. So I thought that was a really interesting take on it. And they didn't really bust you over the head with it, but, I think it was still strong enough to be a really good theme in the movie.
Well, I think the reason that this sticks in so many people's minds is the reality is that this is the story of a lot of small towns, and it continues to be. This is something that continues to be relevant in 2020, is that there was a point in the history of our country when we would have factories and we would have these different places that helped keep small towns alive, and then these businesses and these corporations would take them away, and then all of a sudden these small towns would really struggle, and there was just about nothing they could do to salvage the situation. And I think about the corporations like Walmart that have decimated small towns, and this is certainly an unfortunate reality for so many small towns, is that they went through stuff just like this. And there really isn't a lot else that you could say about it, except that they almost could have gone even farther, but I guess then it would be a different movie. It wouldn't necessarily be a comedy at that point. It would be much more of a drama or a tragedy. But, I mean, this is the reality for a lot of small towns, and it's certainly something that the movie was hinting at, but didn't dive too deeply. I think the other thing that's, the score that you mentioned, I think is very solid, and I think the problem is now there is a hesitation to have a classical score. I think with comedies there is a lot more temptation to have needle drops and more mainstream songs and make that part of the comedy, but I think that a good classical score is appropriate for any movie if it's done well and if it's done correctly. And it's just unfortunate that we've gotten away from those classical scores. I think we certainly do it for big movies, superhero movies, Star Wars, things like that, but I think we've lost that to an extent with comedies, and that's just really unfortunate. And I mean, any movie that has a wedding, and I think is good. I think there's just something about kind of that familial atmosphere that makes it work. And yeah, I think there is an emotional through line for this movie between Tommy Boy and his father that I think works. And I think this movie could have functioned as just a comedy, but they tried to go for something. And I think Brian Dennehy being as good of a performer as he is, I think that's another reason this works, because it would be easy to cast an actor and for them to just tank it, half-ass it, collect a paycheck, that's it. But no, Brian Dennehy was putting in the same level of effort for this movie as he was for the things that he would be doing on stage. And Brian Dennehy has done a lot of movies, but I think that the way that this worked out so much better is, again, because of that heart and because of just those kinds of things. So, yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, I think this movie still does work.
Yeah, and I think for me, my favorite scene is that wedding scene, especially the way it's shot, the way they got David Spade with the handheld camera. Like, it's become a trope, and I don't know if it started with this movie, but it started way before, probably when they had the cameras at weddings and stuff like that. But when he's going around filming all the reactions, and you see him at the table making that deal at his own wedding, just shit like that, and then the performance with the song, and then him and Tommy Boy on stage, that was a great moment. And then all of a sudden, it just becomes tragic. But I thought the way it was well done because it was so unexpected, but it seems so realistic because you look at the size of Brian Dennehy, and then you realize that he didn't want to lose weight in his career when you hear about that. So it was like, okay, it's believable. So I thought that was a really well done scene, and then the way it kind of transitioned into the funeral was really well done editing wise. So I thought that was really good. So overall, there's a lot of great stuff in this movie, but there's still some stuff that really doesn't work, especially now. I feel like Tommy just has this rich privilege, right? Because no matter what, he keeps failing upward. And no matter what, his dad is just going to bail him out, and his dad's going to pay for his 7 years of college and have no debt. And he gets back, and he has his own desk. And even richer, David Spade's just like, dude, what do you have no experience. You have a job. You have an office already. You got everything. Your dad is just like hand feeding you all this stuff, and you don't really deserve it. And I guess he has to earn it throughout the movie, but I still feel like he's still inept and didn't totally earn it all, even though he pulled off a miracle at the end, like a Hail Mary selling 500,000 brake pads. But I don't know. There's just something about this rich white privilege where you just fail upward and you just get a job from your family and just that's it. And he goes to college for 7 years and gets a D plus and passes. I don't know. It just still, I didn't rub me the wrong way when I was younger, but especially now, it kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Well, I think when you think about when this movie was made, 1995, I think that it was much more of an apolitical time. I don't think that we wanted to have an awareness of these issues because of the time period. I think the 1990s were just this part of time when we really didn't address these issues very well. And the fact that he is rich, the fact that he is white, that is undoubtedly a huge part of the privilege that is associated with these characters. And I think the other thing that's worth noting about this situation is that we're also talking about the Midwest as well. And that is a huge component of this as well, because this movie, they are going for that Midwest vibe, the fact that they drive around the Midwest, and the fact that it is a small town in Ohio. I mean, this is a huge part of kind of what they're trying to create. They're going for a specific feeling. The Midwest, the small town, this feeling of Americana, that this is the quote unquote real America. That to live in a big city like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, no, that's not the real America. This is supposed to be like the real America. So they talk about that as something important, but they don't really interrogate the fact that it is a small town and there is a minimal amount of the presence of people of color. I know that there are a couple of seen, but very few are heard from, and kind of what their reaction might be to some of this. And the fact that Tommy Boy can just go in there, go to school for 7 years, and who knows what else happens so that he can even get into the college and the university and all that jazz. I mean, that's it really sucks. And I mean, I think the most offensive part for me is that a student with a D plus could pass a class, because for the most part you shouldn't be able to do that, because you have to have a certain GPA and whatnot. I don't know if it was the 90s or they really just wanted to show how much he was failing upwards, but yeah, D pluses do not, C's get degrees, D's do not get degrees.
Oh God, I don't want to talk about my D plus in fucking astronomy in freshman year of college, but it did affect my GPA, and technically it was a pass, but it was a D plus. I think if it was a D, I wouldn't have passed, but that was just one class. I swear, that was just one class, and then the other class I failed ever was website coding, and that's why I don't make websites. But yeah, it is what it is. They just want you to pass, I guess. But in Tommy Boy's case, it was just part of the comedy that led to an amazing cartwheel. But yeah, that rich privilege, man, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But some other weird things, like I don't know how records were kept back in the day. I don't even know if you can get away with this now. But the fact that Bo Derek and Rob Lowe's characters were married and they were pretending they were mom and son, but the fact they were really married in real life. I don't know how marriage license filings work, but I would assume the person making the marriage license, the Big Tom, would have found this out. Uh, I know it's for the sake of plot device and movie plot and whatever, but and I may be overthinking it, but I just couldn't help but think like they wouldn't have found this out much earlier, even when I was a kid. Like, how do they not know this? Like, I don't know. It was just weird. And Rob Lowe, he's a great performer, but in this movie, I mean, he's really trying to be an asshole. But the fact that they just made him look like an idiot the whole time really made him an effective asshole, even though he did get away with the whole computer thing. And I guess that was his most effective move, but still, he just looked like an idiot the whole time, even when he gets caught at the end. I wish they would have made him more, I don't know, less of a goof, and I think it would have made the movie even better, but I guess they were just going for that goofy kind of real and roll. But yeah, I don't know how that kind of works out with the whole marriage license thing.
I mean, the villains in these movies are generally ineffective and they're almost meant to be cartoons. And I know that part of what you also have in the notes here is that Rob Lowe is an ineffective villain. I think he was mostly okay in Wayne's World and he's very good, in fact, in certain comedies. But this movie, I don't know what the deal was, but Rob Lowe was just not. He was not. It did not feel like he was in the same movie as everybody else. And Bo Derek, also not a spectacular actor in her own right. she just it felt like these two characters were just in a different movie at certain points, and I agree with you to an extent that somebody should have looked this up. I don't know, maybe because Rob Lowe's character really wasn't around as much, but yeah, it's just everything on their side of the movie. I think is why this movie, for me, is not like a total stone cold comedy classic. I think it's certainly got a lot of positive elements to it, but if you are going to go down as one of the best comedies of all time, you've got to clean you got to clean these roles up, and you got to make the villains at least somewhat passable, because at least make them funny. They weren't even necessarily funny. I don't think I laughed at anything that Bo Derek or Rob Lowe did once.
Yeah, other than him and Farley in the car about, being brothers and stuff, that was funny, but then him pissing on the electrical stuff, that was random. Didn't really, that was totally random, actually. But again, they were just going for that physical comedy kind of bit, but is what it is. The third act of the ending, it was just thrown together. I don't know. Again, it's not necessarily Farley failing upward again, but the fact that they kind of not hijack a plane, but they impersonate stewards, and then he inadvertently tries a bank robbery, but that's not his fault. But he does strap flares to his chest and then threatens a terrorist bombing, which I think is illegal, obviously. Gets away with it, and then happens to get a news camera to do a live camera interview with Zelensky on television, which somehow just got clearance on live television on the fly. Just a crazy ending to, I don't know. I just felt like they needed to tie all these things together, and then like, what can we do? What can we make Farley do? And then they just kind of threw this together without any actual logical thinking to it. And I know this movie is trying to not to be the most logical movie ever, but at parts of the movie it felt, like this was a, good heartfelt comedy. So I think the ending kind of threw it off a little bit. Even now, like years later, it's just like there's a lot of crazy shit that they should not have gotten away with. But and then it was so random too with David Spade's hairpiece. I still don't. I mean, it's funny, but it's just like it's random, and it's like, okay, what did that have to do with the plot though? But it's just one of those things.
Even at watching this for multiple times, I always forget about David Spade's toupee. Every time it's just there and it throws me off. I don't know what. I mean, they were clearly going for it as a joke and clearly going for it because it was funny, and probably they always made fun of him because the hair looks fake, but it was really weird.
And random, just totally random. But that's kind of what doesn't work for me. I don't know about anything else for you, but that's kind of my take on it. Just the privilege stuff, and then the villains in the third act. But other than that, I think it's just you're laughing at Farley, you're laughing at Spade, you're having these heartfelt moments, you're rooting for him at the end, and then you're smiling at the end. We're on the boat when he's on the boat. So I don't know about you. What else doesn't work for you?
I mean, the stuff on the airplane is just weird. I mean, maybe it's because I'm so used to what the airline situation is like now, but man, it's just so random, and the things that they're saying, and yeah, I mean, it's just, especially because we've spent so much time reviewing over more serious movies, and even movies where you're kind of in the world of plausibility, and some of these comedies are just not plausible. So yeah, it's very strange to see what they were able to get away with on that airplane.
Yeah. So for me, 7.5 out of 10. It's a comedy cult classic. It's not one of the top tiers, but it's definitely one of those that's like, you own it and you watch it with your friends sometimes, and you're watching it on TV in the background, and it's you could just hear it in the background and just watch it from the background while you're working on a project kind of movie. So for me, going on to our MVPs, I'm gonna go with Bonnie and Terry Turner, the writers of this movie. I feel like they know how to put these kind of movies together at the right time in the 90s. Because this, and I mentioned Wayne's World 1 and 2 and Coneheads, man. Those are four of my favorite comedies as a kid, and I don't know. I just felt like each of those movies are very similar, but they have this heart to them. You know what I mean? I think that's the key to have a good comedy by the end of it, is having the heroes you're rooting for at the end and you really care about them. And in this case, I think like I said, that beautiful scene at the end kind of encapsulates that. So for me, those are my MVPs.
Yeah, I can't really think of anyone else that I would potentially want to call the MVP except for Chris Farley, because I think in so many ways he makes this movie work. But yeah, I think that Bonnie and Terry Turner kind of bringing this together, and creating something of a plot for them to do. And I think that's something else that has changed over the last 20 years or so is I think movies used to be made as star vehicles to get across kind of the performances and the performers themselves. I think that we are so much less, the star system is so much less, and it's more about the IP that it's associated with, or the writers, or kind of the concept behind the story. Whereas a movie like this, the plot almost doesn't matter. It's more about the showcasing of the performers, and I think that that's another way that movie making has changed so much over the course of the last 20 years or so. Because now you just wouldn't see this. So it's pretty unusual to see a movie like this now that is so much about the stars, and you just don't get that now. You don't even get that with comedies. Even comedies today are so much more about, the high-end concept of what they're doing and kind of the plot, and it's so much less so about the performances.
Yeah, and we kind of forgot to mention Peter Segal, the director, but the thing is, like, this was his second movie. His first one was Naked Gun 33 and a third, which is okay. It's definitely the least of the Naked Gun movies, and his filmography is not as great. It's just a bunch of B to C level comedies, some featuring Adam Sandler. Maybe, I'm not a fan of Anger Management, but if you're a fan of Anger Management, that might be his other high profile movie. I do like 50 First Dates a lot, so that's probably this and 50 First Dates are probably my two favorite Peter Segal movies, which is not saying a lot. But he did recently do that spy movie, My Spy, so he's still kind of relevant, but I think this is definitely his high point, which was pretty early in his career. So, and of course, best performance, Chris Farley, no doubt. I mean, what can you say that hasn't already been said about this guy's career? It's like could have been, would have been, but I think that it would have taken some time to get to that dramatic point. But you can see shades of it. He could have pulled some great, dramatic moments here and there if he was in one of those roles, like I don't know, like instead of Jonah Hill, could you imagine Chris Farley as Paul DiPodesto? In Moneyball kind of thing. That's kind of those roles that I picture him as. And I don't want to just say he's like a Jonah. He would have been a Jonah Hill type, But I can imagine him in certain kind of roles. He had some kind of range to him. You could see the range that he had in SNL when all these different kind of characters that he played. He was just doing comedy, but the fact that he was able to have these different ranges and different emotions, I think, would have elevated him later on.
Yeah, I mean, you ultimately don't know what a person's career is going to be like. I mean, there's just no possible way to be able to identify that. But I think that he certainly did what he could in the time that he was given, and that's really all that can be said. I mean, undoubtedly he is the best performance of this movie, and there really isn't any doubt about that, and there really can't even be an argument for it. And I think that, Peter Segal is a perfectly acceptable comedic director, some good, some bad, but it's just a situation where, again, so much of this is about the actors and the performers kind of getting a showcase, not necessarily the directors.
For sure, and that kind of wraps up our discussion for this week on Tommy Boy. I mean, it's definitely. I mean, you've probably seen it a million times, knowing our audience. But again, if you've never seen this movie, go check it out. I mean, I would even own it. I would just blind buy it because it's worth it. So definitely check it out. Next week, we're moving on a road trip. Actually, this movie comes out just a week later after this movie came out in the spring of '95. We're gonna get a little goofy, and we're gonna watch a goofy movie. And I love this movie as a kid. It's grown on me. It's kind of grown into this cult classic for some members of the black community. Some black millennials have kind of pointed to this movie as being really inspirational to them. So we'll check it out. I know this is Jerome's first time watching the movie, and it could be, I don't know. We're not that far in age, Jerome, but I don't know if you just watch this at the wrong time, and I just watched this at the right time because I watched it VHS, I think 96 or 97. Years after it came out, and I watched it like in one of those after school program things, and yeah, we were all laughing at Bigfoot.
I am pretty sure I saw this in movie theaters, so I don't know where you got your information about this being my first time, but I think I saw this in theaters, because seeing this again, I definitely remembered some parts of it, so I definitely have seen this movie before, but my opinion is probably not going to be as generous as when I saw it in April or May of 1995.
Yeah, that's to come next week. It's going to be really interesting considering because we're probably going to be on two opposite sides of the spectrum on this one because despite it's not the greatest Disney movie ever, it's not the greatest writing ever, but it does have some memorable characters and moments and some really I think heartfelt moments that a comedy needs, like we mentioned here in Tommy Boy. So that's for next week, and that will wrap up Road Trip Month here in September. It's been quite the bumpy journey, but we're almost at the end, and we're going to take you on a goofy ride next week. So that's it for this week. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.
The height of white privilege, Brian, was actually Chris Farley being able to hold that bank up twice.